over slavery and other issues had been building between the North and the South. The common folk of Tennessee and other states had gone about their everyday lives, working their farms, tending to their businesses, raising their families, and believing that somehow the problems would be resolved. War had come. A destructive fury swept over the land for 4 years. Before it was over, it touched nearly everyone. Like most wars, this one seemed to take on a life of its own, forcing even peaceful, neutral people to take sides. In the beginning, it did not seem so terrible. "Defend our rights and liberties," said many in the South. "The Union forever," responded many in the North. Smooth-faced teenagers flocked to the recruiting stands. Rosy-cheeked recruits and saber-rattling politicians on both sides thought it would be a short war, lasting only a few months. Within a few months, ill-trained armies of the eager volunteers were shooting at each other. In the West, the Confederates prepared to defend the South by establishing a line running roughly along Tennessee's northern border. But in February 1862, this line was smashed when an obscure Union general named Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. It was a major victory for the Union. Now the way was clear for the capture of most of Middle and West Tennessee, including the state capital at Nashville. Many Confederate partisans had to flee from their homes. Nashville was thrown into panic at the prospect of federal occupation, and the state government fled to Memphis. 2 months later, at a place called Shiloh, the romance of war disappeared. At Shiloh, the Confederates tried to strike back into Tennessee. For 2 days in April, some 100,000 men, most of whom had never seen battle before, waged a bloody fight. It was the biggest battle that had ever occurred in America. When it was over, almost 25,000 men had been killed or wounded, 1/4 of those who fought. Union Commander Ulysses Grant recalled a clearing one could walk across, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground. The South never smiled again after Shiloh, wrote Southern author George Washington Cable. The bitter experience of Shiloh was to be repeated again and again as Tennessee became the primary battlefield of the war in the West. At Memphis, Murfreesboro, Knoxville, Chattanooga, at Franklin and Nashville, and at hundreds of other places. Before it was over, more battles and skirmishes had been fought in Tennessee than in any other state in the West, and the war affected nearly every family. Eventually, more than 140,000 Tennesseans joined the Confederate Army, while 50,000 black and white Tennesseans joined the Union Army. In the wake of great armies, marauding bands of partisans and bandits terrorized the countryside. Death could come suddenly to almost anyone. Crops and farms were destroyed, and food shortages became a part of life. So did prostitution and gambling, diversions which traditionally traveled in the wake of armies. "Go from Memphis to Chattanooga," wrote a northern newspaperman. "It's like the March on Moscow in olden times. Whether you go on any other pike for a distance of 30 miles in either way, it's one wild and dreary waste." The guerrilla war was especially bitter in East Tennessee, where a majority of the people had opposed secession. "Some have been butchered," wrote one Unionist. "Others shot down in their own homes or yards. Others have been hung up without judge or jury." At the end of 1864, the Army of Tennessee, the great Southern force in the West, returned to Tennessee to play out its last and perhaps most tragic act. Atlanta had just been lost, and, almost in an act of desperation, the Confederates moved back into Middle Tennessee towards Nashville. On November 30th, they struck at a Union army in Franklin, south of Nashville. The Confederates launched frontal assaults against entrenched troops in what turned out to be one of the bloodiest days of the war. Confederates lost 1/4 of their men as casualties, including 6 generals who were killed. The dead were piled up like shocks of wheat, wrote one Confederate. The Federals withdrew from Franklin to Nashville, and the bloodied Army of Tennessee followed them. At Nashville, the Confederates dug in to face a Union army now more than twice its size. On a cold day in December, Union soldiers launched an attack on the ill-equipped Southerners. After 2 days of desperate fighting, the Confederates were decisively defeated and forced into a disorganized retreat. The Confederate defeat at the Battle of Nashville signaled the end. The war dragged on for 4 more months. Then it was over. The once mighty Army of Tennessee surrendered to William T. Sherman on April 26, 1865. Robert E. Lee had already surrendered the other main Confederate army 17 days earlier at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Tennesseans, whether they had supported the Confederacy or the Union, began to try to piece their lives together again. It was a time for reconciliation. As Tennessee's foremost warrior, Confederate Lieutenant General Nathan Bedford Forrest told his men after their surrender, "Civil war naturally engenders animosity, hatred, and revenge. It is our duty to divest ourselves of all such feelings toward those with whom we have so long contested." But the wounds of war were deep and long-lasting. 1 out of every 4 Confederate soldiers and 1 out of every 5 Union soldiers had died. Thousands more were maimed and crippled. Nearly every family had been touched. The war brought an end to slavery, but despite the promise of freedom, the future for African Americans was uncertain. Even as the nation began to grope for new solutions to old problems, President Abraham Lincoln was killed by an assassin's bullet. A Tennessean named Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency and faced an era of national reconstruction.